I was standing in my driveway on a Tuesday morning in March 2025 when I noticed the surveyor's stakes driven into my front lawn, and that's when I realized something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. My name is Ivan Dawson, and I'd lived in my house on Maple Ridge Drive in Greenwood, Indiana for 7 years. It was a modest 3-bedroom ranch on 2 acres of land that I'd purchased specifically because it was outside the boundaries of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I'd done my homework before buying. I'd checked the plat maps, reviewed the property deed, and confirmed with the county recorder's office that my land was unincorporated and free from any HOA jurisdiction. I valued my freedom too much to be told what color I could paint my mailbox or how tall my grass could grow. But there they were, bright orange stakes with little plastic flags forming a line that cut straight through my property. I walked over to the nearest stake and pulled it out of the ground. A white tag attached to it read, Willow Creek HOA Boundary Survey, March 2025. My stomach dropped. I looked up and saw a man in a reflective vest taking measurements near my fence line. "Hey!" I called out, walking toward him. "What's going on here?" The surveyor looked up from his equipment, checking his clipboard. "Property boundary survey for the Willow Creek HOA, updating their official boundaries." "This is my property," I said, gesturing around. "I'm not part of any HOA." He shrugged. "I just go where they tell me, buddy. You'll have to take it up with the association. I got my work orders right here." He tapped his clipboard like that explained everything. I pulled out my phone and called the HOA office. A chipper voice answered. "Willow Creek Homeowners Association, this is Deborah speaking. How may I help you?" "This is Ivan Dawson at 1847 Maple Ridge Drive. There are surveyors on my property right now, and I need to know what's going on." There was a pause, some keyboard clicking. "Oh yes, Mr. Dawson. Your property was recently annexed into the Willow Creek HOA boundaries as of March 1st. You should have received notice in the mail." "Annexed?" I felt my blood pressure rising. "You can't just annex my property. I specifically bought this house because it wasn't part of an HOA. The association voted to expand our boundaries last month, sir. It was all done according to Indiana state statutes. Your property falls within the new jurisdiction. You'll need to pay the annual dues of $3,000 by April 1st, and of course, you'll need to bring your property into compliance with our covenants, conditions, and restrictions." "I never agreed to this," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I never voted on anything because I'm not a member of your HOA." "Well, you are now," Deborah said with saccharine sweetness. "The documentation was filed with the county last week. If you have concerns, you can attend our next board meeting on Thursday at 7 p.m. Have a wonderful day." She hung up. I stood there staring at my phone, feeling like I'd just been punched in the gut. This couldn't be legal. You can't just force someone's property into an HOA without their consent. Could you? I spent the rest of that day researching Indiana property law and HOA regulations. What I discovered was disturbing. Apparently, under certain circumstances, an HOA could expand its boundaries through a process called annexation. But from what I read, it typically required either the property owner's consent or meeting very specific legal criteria, including notice and opportunity to object. I'd received no notice, no letter, no email, no certified mail, nothing. The next morning, I drove to the Marion County Recorder's office in Indianapolis. The clerk pulled up the records on her computer. Sure enough, there was a newly recorded document titled Amended Declaration of Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions for Willow Creek Homeowners Association, dated February 28, 2025. The document included a revised boundary map that now encompassed my property and 3 others. "Can I get copies of everything related to this?" I asked. "Sure thing," the clerk said. "That'll be 25 cents per page." I walked out with a thick stack of papers that cost me $18. I sat in my truck in the parking lot and started reading. The amended declaration claimed that the 4 properties, including mine, had always been intended to be part of the development but were erroneously excluded from the original plat in 1998. It stated that correcting this administrative error was in the best interest of the community and property values. It was complete nonsense. My property had never been part of any development. It was farmland that got subdivided and sold off separately. I had the original deed to prove it, I needed a lawyer. I called 3 attorneys that afternoon. The first 2 didn't handle HOA cases. The third, a woman named Patricia Chen, agreed to meet with me the next day. Her office was in a renovated house in Broad Ripple, and she had framed diplomas from Indiana University on every wall. "This is interesting," Patricia said after I'd explained the situation and shown her the documents. She was probably in her 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "And you received no notice at all?" "Nothing. I didn't know anything about it until I saw surveyors in my yard." She flipped through the papers, making notes. "Indiana code requires specific procedures for HOA annexation. They need to provide written notice to affected property owners at least 60 days before any vote. The notice must be sent by certified mail to the address on record with the county." "I got nothing," I repeated. "Then they violated state law," Patricia said simply. "The annexation is invalid. We can challenge this." She quoted me her hourly rate, which made me wince, but I didn't have much choice. "Do it," I said. Patricia drafted a formal objection letter and filed it with the county that same week. She also sent a strongly worded letter to the Willow Creek HOA board, informing them that the annexation was illegal and demanding they remove my property from their jurisdiction immediately. The response came 3 days later, but not from a lawyer. It came in the form of a woman pounding on my front door at 8 in the morning on Saturday. I opened the door to find a blonde woman in her late 40s wearing a designer tracksuit and enough jewelry to stock a small boutique. Her face was already red, and she looked ready to explode. "Are you Ivan Dawson?" she demanded. "That's me." "I'm Susan Mitchell, president of the Willow Creek HOA board, and we need to talk about your little stunt." "My stunt?" I said. "You mean hiring a lawyer to protect my property rights?" "You're disrupting the entire community," Susan snapped. "The annexation was voted on and approved by the board. It's legal and binding. You need to accept it and pay your dues like everyone else." "I'm not part of your community," I said, keeping my voice level. "I deliberately bought property outside your HOA boundaries. You don't have the right to force me into your association." Susan's eyes narrowed. "Your property is an eyesore that brings down everyone's home values. That rusty truck in your driveway, your unmowed lawn, that shed in your backyard that looks like it's about to fall over. It's unacceptable." My rusty truck was a 1985 Ford F-150 that I was restoring. The lawn was a 1/4 acre of natural prairie grass that I'd planted intentionally to support pollinators, and my shed was a perfectly sound outbuilding that stored my tools and lawn equipment. "Get off my property," I said quietly. "Excuse me?" "You heard me. Get off my property. You have no authority here and you're trespassing." Susan's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "You're going to regret this. The board has ways of dealing with problem residents." "I'm not a resident of your HOA," I said, "and if you're not off my property in 30 seconds, I'm calling the police." She jabbed a finger at me. "You'll be hearing from our attorney." Then she turned and stormed back to her white Mercedes SUV. I watched her peel out of my driveway and immediately called Patricia. "She said what?" Patricia asked after I'd recounted the conversation. "That the board has ways of dealing with problem residents." It sounded like a threat. "It was a threat," Patricia confirmed. "Document everything. Save any emails, letters, or messages. Keep a log of every interaction. If this escalates, we'll need evidence." It escalated. 2 days later, I received a formal notice from the Willow Creek HOA citing me for 17 violations of their covenants. The list was absurd. My truck violated the rule against inoperable or unsightly vehicles. My prairie grass violated the landscaping standards requiring regularly mowed turf grass no taller than 4 inches. My shed violated setback requirements. My front door color, which was a perfectly normal dark green, violated the approved color palette. The list went on and on. Each violation carried a fine of $100 per day until corrected. The total already exceeded $5,000, and it had only been 2 days since the annexation. Patricia filed an emergency motion with the Marion County Superior Court for a temporary restraining order against the HOA, arguing that they were attempting to impose fines and penalties for an illegal annexation. The judge scheduled a hearing for the following week. In the meantime, things got worse. On Monday, I came home from my job at the manufacturing plant, where I worked as a quality control supervisor to find a bright orange notice taped to my front door. Notice of lien. Your property has been assessed $8,500 in outstanding HOA dues and violation fines. Failure to pay within 30 days may result in foreclosure proceedings. Foreclosure. They were threatening to take my house. I called Patricia immediately. She was livid. They're trying to intimidate you. They can't foreclose based on an illegal annexation. We'll address this at the hearing. But Susan Mitchell wasn't done. That Wednesday, I received a visit from the Greenwood Police Department. An officer in his 30s stood on my porch, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Dawson, I'm Officer Miller. We received a complaint about abandoned vehicles on your property." I blinked. "Abandoned vehicles? You mean my truck?" "Madam from the Homeowners Association says there's been an inoperable vehicle parked in your driveway for months, possibly leaking fluids." I led Officer Miller to my truck. It was under a car cover, but I pulled it back to show him. "It's a restoration project. It runs fine and it's not leaking anything. The HOA is harassing me because I'm fighting their illegal annexation of my property." Officer Miller looked at the truck, walked around it, and nodded. "Looks fine to me. Just keep the registration current and you're good. I'll note in my report that there's no violation." He lowered his voice. "For what it's worth, I've responded to a lot of calls from that HOA. They seem pretty aggressive." "Tell me about it," I muttered. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m. Patricia and I arrived at the courthouse with 3 banker's boxes full of documentation. The Willow Creek HOA was represented by an attorney named Robert Keller, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who had Susan Mitchell and 2 other board members with him. Judge Raymond Martinez presided. He was an older Hispanic man with a reputation for being no-nonsense but fair. Patricia laid out our case methodically. She demonstrated that I had never received any notice of the proposed annexation. She presented my property deed, showing that my land had never been part of the Willow Creek development. She cited the specific Indiana statutes that required notice and consent for annexation. She documented the harassment, the excessive fines, and the threats of foreclosure. Robert Keller argued that the annexation was correcting a historical error, that proper procedures had been followed, and that the association had sent notice to my address via certified mail. "Do you have proof of this notice?" Judge Martinez asked. Keller shuffled through his papers. "We have records showing that notice was sent." "I asked for proof, Mr. Keller. A certified mail receipt with Mr. Dawson's signature?" More shuffling. "The association's records indicate notice was provided in accordance with the bylaws." "That's not an answer," the judge said dryly. "Mr. Dawson, did you receive any notice?" "No, Your Honor," I said. "No letter, no certified mail, nothing. The first I heard about this was when surveyors showed up on my property." Judge Martinez reviewed the documents for several long minutes. Finally, he looked up. "I'm granting the temporary restraining order. The Willow Creek HOA is enjoined from collecting any dues, imposing any fines, or taking any action against Mr. Dawson's property, pending a full hearing on the merits. That hearing will be scheduled within 60 days. Mr. Keller, your clients need to follow proper legal procedures. You can't just annex property without notice and due process." We walked out of the courthouse, and I felt like I could breathe for the first time in 2 weeks. "This is a good start," Patricia said, "but we need to prepare for the full hearing. They're not going to give up easily." She was right. Over the next month, I discovered just how deep the rabbit hole went. Patricia hired a private investigator named Tom Reeves, a retired detective who specialized in civil cases. What Tom found was shocking. The Willow Creek HOA hadn't just annexed my property. They'd done it before, multiple times over the past 5 years. Tom uncovered records showing that the HOA had gradually expanded their boundaries to include 7 other properties besides mine. 2 of those property owners had fought back, but both had eventually given up and either paid the dues or sold their homes. The others had simply complied, not knowing they had legal grounds to resist. But it got worse. Tom discovered that Susan Mitchell and 2 other board members, a man named Richard Pemberton and a woman named Linda Crawford, had a financial interest in the annexations. They were partners in a property management company that received contracts from the HOA to handle maintenance, landscaping, and security. The more properties in the HOA, the bigger the budget and the more money their company made. It was a conflict of interest at minimum, potentially fraud and embezzlement. Patricia filed an amended complaint that included these findings. She also contacted the Indiana Attorney General's office, which had a division that handled HOA complaints and enforcement. The response was swift. The Attorney General's office opened an investigation into Willow Creek HOA. They sent investigators who requested financial records, board meeting minutes, and correspondence. Susan Mitchell's smug confidence started to crack. The full hearing was scheduled for May 15th. In the weeks leading up to it, I received several messages from other Willow Creek HOA members who had seen news coverage of the case. Some thanked me for standing up to the board. Others were furious, accusing me of trying to destroy their community. One woman named Karen Reynolds, who lived 3 houses down from the HOA boundary, left a particularly nasty voicemail. "You're ruining everything. Our property values are going to plummet because of you. Why can't you just follow the rules like everyone else? You're being selfish and childish. Grow up and pay your dues." I saved the voicemail. Patricia said it was more evidence of harassment. The day before the hearing, I received a call from Robert Keller. "Mr. Dawson, I think we should talk settlement," he said. "I'm listening." "The board is willing to remove your property from the annexation. You'll have no obligation to pay any dues or fines. In exchange, you agree not to pursue any further legal action against the association." I was tempted. This was what I wanted, right? To be left alone? But I thought about the other property owners who'd been forced into the HOA. I thought about Susan Mitchell and her partners profiting from this scheme. I thought about the next person they'd try to push around. "No deal," I said. "I'll see you in court." Patricia grinned when I told her. "Good, because the Attorney General's office just informed me they're expanding their investigation. They found evidence of financial irregularities going back years." The hearing was held in the same courtroom, but this time it was packed. Media outlets had picked up the story. Local homeowners' rights groups were there. Several Willow Creek HOA members attended, sitting on opposite sides of the courtroom like a divorce proceeding. Patricia presented our case over 3 hours. She called Tom Reeves to testify about his findings. She entered financial records into evidence showing the payments to the property management company owned by the board members. She presented testimony from 2 of the other property owners who'd been previously annexed, both of whom admitted they'd never received proper notice. Robert Keller tried to defend the board's actions, but it was clear he was fighting a losing battle. His arguments about administrative errors and community benefit rang hollow against the mountain of evidence showing systematic violations of state law. Then the Attorney General's office representative, a prosecutor named James Holland, stood up. "Your Honor, the state of Indiana would like to intervene in this matter. Our investigation has revealed that the Willow Creek Homeowners Association has engaged in a pattern of illegal annexations, conflicts of interest, and financial mismanagement. We're prepared to present evidence of criminal misconduct by members of the board." The courtroom erupted. Judge Martinez banged his gavel for order. What followed was devastating for Susan Mitchell and her associates. James Holland presented evidence that the board had diverted over $200,000 in HOA funds to their property management company through fraudulent contracts. They'd billed for services never performed, inflated invoices, and paid themselves bonuses that were never approved by the general membership. The illegal annexations were just one part of a larger scheme to increase their profits. Judge Martinez listened to everything with an increasingly stern expression. When the presentations finally concluded, he didn't hesitate. "Officially, I've seen a lot of HOA disputes in my courtroom, but this is one of the most egregious examples of abuse of power I've encountered. The annexation of Mr. Dawson's property is declared null and void, as are all previous annexations conducted without proper notice and procedure. The Willow Creek HOA is ordered to immediately remove all improperly annexed properties from their jurisdiction and refund any dues collected." He paused, looking directly at Susan Mitchell. "Furthermore, based on the evidence presented by the Attorney General's office, I'm referring this matter to the Marion County Prosecutor for criminal investigation. The HOA's assets are frozen pending further legal action." Susan's face went white. Richard Pemberton looked like he might be sick. Linda Crawford was already crying. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. The actions of this board have called into question the entire legitimacy of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I'm ordering a forensic audit of all HOA finances for the past 10 years. If the Attorney General's office determines that the association was formed or operated in violation of Indiana nonprofit corporation law, the state may pursue dissolution. That word hung in the air. Dissolution. The entire HOA could be shut down. The hearing concluded, and reporters swarmed us outside the courtroom. Patricia handled most of the questions while I stood awkwardly beside her. That evening, my phone blew up with calls and messages. Some were supportive. Others were angry residents blaming me for destroying their neighborhood. Karen Reynolds left another voicemail. I hope you're happy. You've destroyed our community. The board was just trying to maintain standards, and you couldn't follow simple rules. Now our property values are going to tank, and it's all your fault. I deleted it and blocked her number. Over the next few weeks, the story continued to unfold. The Marion County prosecutor formally charged Susan Mitchell, Richard Pemberton, and Linda Crawford with theft, fraud, and abuse of fiduciary duty. The forensic audit revealed even more financial irregularities. The board had been skimming money for years. The Attorney General's office filed a petition to dissolve the Willow Creek Homeowners Association entirely. Under Indiana law, an HOA can be dissolved if it's been operated in a manner contrary to law or against the interests of its members. The evidence was overwhelming. In July 2025, Judge Martinez granted the petition. The Willow Creek Homeowners Association was officially dissolved by court order. All covenants, conditions, and restrictions were declared null and void. Property owners were free from any HOA obligations. The reaction was mixed. Some residents were relieved, tired of the board's petty rules and high fees. Others were upset, worried about property maintenance and neighborhood standards without an HOA to enforce them. A group of residents tried to form a voluntary neighborhood association, but it never gained much traction. Most people were just happy to be left alone. As for the criminal cases, they moved slowly through the system. Susan Mitchell eventually pleaded guilty to theft and fraud charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay restitution. Richard Pemberton and Linda Crawford took plea deals as well, each receiving probation and community service. The property management company they owned was liquidated, and the assets were used to repay the HOA members who'd been defrauded. Throughout the summer and into fall, I finally had peace. My property was mine again, free and clear. I finished restoring my truck and drove it proudly around Greenwood. I let my prairie grass grow tall and wild, attracting butterflies and bees. I painted my front door a brighter shade of green just because I could. One evening in October, I was working in my garage when a car pulled up. A man in his 60s got out, walking with a slight limp. Mr. Dawson, I'm George Hartley. I used to live over on Willow Creek Drive. I recognized the name. He was one of the property owners who'd been annexed years ago and eventually sold his house. I wanted to thank you, George said. I fought the HOA when they annexed my property back in 2021. Spent thousands on a lawyer, but I eventually gave up. Sold my house at a loss just to get away from them. When I heard what you did, that you actually beat them and got the whole association dissolved, I had to come shake your hand. We shook hands, and George's eyes were watery. You did what I couldn't do. You stood up to bullies and won. That takes courage. I just wanted to protect my property, I said. That's exactly what it was about, George agreed. Property rights, freedom, the things this country is supposed to stand for. You reminded people of that. After George left, I stood in my driveway as the sun set, looking at my house and land. It had been a hell of a year. The legal battle had cost me over $30,000, even with the eventual settlement from the HOA's insurance. It had been stressful, exhausting, and at times frightening, but it had been worth it. Patricia called me the next week with news. Several other HOAs in Indiana were facing challenges from property owners inspired by my case. The Attorney General's office was conducting a broader review of HOA practices statewide. There was even talk of the legislature passing new laws to strengthen property owner rights and increase oversight of HOAs. "You started something," Patricia said. "People are paying attention now." In November, I received a letter from the Indiana Secretary of State's office. It was a formal notification that the Willow Creek Homeowners Association had been permanently dissolved and removed from the state's registry of nonprofit corporations. All recorded covenants affecting my property and the others had been vacated from the county records. It was really, truly over. I framed the letter and hung it in my garage next to my restoration tools. As winter approached and 2025 drew to a close, life returned to normal. I worked my job, I spent weekends fixing up my house and property, and I enjoyed the simple freedom of not having anyone tell me what I could or couldn't do with my own land. Karen Reynolds actually apologized to me one day when I ran into her at the grocery store. Her property had been one of those improperly annexed years ago, and when the HOA was dissolved, she discovered she'd paid over $15,000 in dues for an association she'd never legally been part of. She was getting most of it back in the restitution settlement. "I was wrong," she admitted, looking embarrassed. "I blamed you for disrupting things, but you were right. What they did was illegal and wrong. I'm sorry for the things I said." "Apology accepted," I said. "It took guts to admit you were wrong. The civil lawsuits against the former board members dragged on for months, but eventually, settlements were reached. The insurance company that had provided liability coverage for the HOA paid out over $1 million to the victims of the fraud. Every property owner who'd been illegally annexed received compensation. I got a check for $45,000, which more than covered my legal fees and compensated me for the stress and violation of my rights. In March 2026, exactly 1 year after this nightmare began, I hosted a barbecue at my house. I invited George Hartley, Patricia Chen, Tom Reeves, and several of the other property owners who'd been affected by the HOA's illegal actions. We grilled burgers and drank beer, celebrating our freedom and the dissolution of an organization that had caused so much trouble. "To property rights," Patricia said, raising her bottle. "To standing up to bullies," Tom added. "To justice," George said quietly. "To being left the hell alone," I said, and everyone laughed and drank to that. As the sun set and my guests eventually left, I sat on my porch looking out at my land. My prairie grass was dormant for winter, but it would come back green and wild in the spring. My truck was parked in the driveway, fully restored and running beautifully. My shed stood solid and strong in the backyard. Everything was exactly as it should be. The story made the rounds in homeowner rights circles. I was interviewed for a few podcasts and even a local news documentary about HOA abuse. I wasn't comfortable with the attention, but if sharing my experience helped other people understand their rights and stand up for themselves, it was worth it. The Indiana legislature did pass new laws in early 2026, largely in response to the Willow Creek case and others like it. The laws strengthened notice requirements for HOA actions, increased oversight of HOA finances, and made it much harder to annex property without explicit owner consent. Property owners were given a clear right to challenge annexations and other HOA actions without fear of retaliation. It wasn't a complete solution to the problems with HOAs, but it was a step in the right direction. Several lawyers contacted me about writing a book or making a movie about the case. I turned them all down. I'm not interested in fame or attention. I just wanted my peaceful life back. And I got it. As spring 2026 arrived, I planted a small garden in my front yard, something that definitely would have violated the old HOA rules. Tomatoes, peppers, herbs, and flowers all mixed together in a glorious, productive mess. My neighbors drove by and waved. Some stopped to chat and admire the garden. Nobody complained. Nobody threatened to fine me. Nobody tried to force me to rip it out. That's what freedom feels like. One afternoon in April, I was weeding the garden when a young couple pulled up. They introduced themselves as prospective homebuyers looking at houses in the area. "We heard about what happened with the HOA here," the woman said. "Is it really all dissolved? No HOA at all?" "That's right," I confirmed. "The state shut it down for illegal operations. All the covenants are gone." The couple looked at each other and grinned. "That's exactly what we were hoping to hear," the man said. "We've been looking for a place without an HOA. They're so hard to find anymore." "Well, you found one," I said. "Welcome to the neighborhood." They bought a house 2 streets over. As time went on, I noticed more young families and individuals moving into the former Willow Creek area. Without the HOA restrictions and fees, the neighborhood became more affordable and attractive to people who valued freedom over enforced conformity. Some yards were immaculate, some were more natural and wild like mine. Some people painted their houses in bold colors, others kept them traditional. It was diverse, it was interesting, and it was real. It was what a neighborhood should be. People living their lives as they chose, being good neighbors through choice rather than coercion. The former board members finished their sentences and faded into obscurity. Susan Mitchell moved out of state. Richard Pemberton took a job in private landscaping, ironically enough. Linda Crawford became active in prison reform advocacy, perhaps learning from her own experience with the justice system. Robert Keller, their attorney, faced disciplinary action from the Indiana State Bar for his role in the scheme. He didn't lose his license, but he received a public reprimand and had to take ethics training. As for me, life went on. I got a promotion at work, which was nice. I dated a woman named Julie for a few months, but it didn't work out. I bought a second project vehicle, a 1968 Chevrolet Camaro that I found at an estate sale. I spent my weekends working on it in my garage, and nobody complained about the noise or the car parts in my yard. I stayed in touch with Patricia Chen. She'd become something of a specialist in HOA litigation after the publicity from my case. She called me occasionally to let me know about other cases she was working on, other people standing up to abusive HOAs. "You inspired a movement," she told me. "People aren't just rolling over anymore." "Good," I said. "Nobody should have to go through what I went through." In May 2026, the one-year anniversary of Judge Martinez's ruling dissolving the HOA, a local newspaper ran a retrospective article on the case. They interviewed several former Willow Creek HOA members, getting their thoughts a year later. The opinions were still mixed. Some people still blamed me for destroying their association, convinced that property values had suffered. Others thanked me for freeing them from tyranny. A few were philosophical, acknowledging that the board's corruption had made dissolution inevitable regardless of what I'd done. George Hartley was quoted in the article. "Ivan Dawson did what every American should do when their rights are violated. He stood his ground, he fought back legally and properly, and he won. That's not destroying a community, that's defending the principles this country was built on." I appreciated that. By summer 2026, the entire saga felt like ancient history. The surveyor's stakes in my yard were long gone, replaced by thriving garden plants. The threats and harassment were distant memories. The legal bills were paid, the criminals were punished, justice had been served. I was free. One evening in July, I was sitting on my porch with a beer, watching the fireflies come out as dusk settled over my property. My prairie grass swayed in the breeze, alive with crickets and other insects. My restored truck sat in the driveway, gleaming in the fading light. My garden was producing more tomatoes than I could eat. A neighbor, a retired teacher named Frank who lived down the road, walked by walking his dog. "Evening, Ivan," he called. "Evening, Frank. Nice night." "Beautiful," he agreed. "You've got quite a garden going." "Thanks, I'll bring you some tomatoes when they're ready." "I'd appreciate that." He tipped his head and continued his walk. Simple, normal, neighborly interaction. No rules, no fines, no threats. Just people being people. That's what I'd fought for. Not to be a hero or to make a statement or to change the world. Just to be left alone to live my life on my own property in peace. But in fighting for that simple freedom, I'd ended up doing something bigger. I'd exposed corruption. I'd helped other people escape from an oppressive system. I'd contributed to changing laws that would protect property owners for years to come. Sometimes standing up for yourself means standing up for everyone. The story of how the Willow Creek HOA tried to annex my property without consent, and how I fought back until the entire association was dissolved by the state, became a cautionary tale. It was taught in law schools as an example of HOA overreach. It was discussed in property rights organizations. It was cited in legislative debates about HOA reform. But for me, it was just the time I had to defend my home. As the stars came out that July evening, I reflected on everything that had happened. The surprise, the anger, the fear, the long legal battle, the victory, and finally, the peace that followed. It had been the most stressful period of my life, but also the most meaningful. I'd discovered that I was capable of more than I thought. I'd found allies in unexpected places. I'd learned that the legal system, while imperfect and slow, could actually work when you had the facts on your side. And I'd learned that home isn't just a building or a piece of land. It's the freedom to make that space your own, to live according to your values, to be yourself without fear of punishment or control. That freedom is worth fighting for. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia. "Hey, got another client dealing with illegal HOA annexation in Fishers. Told them about your case. They're ready to fight. Thought you'd want to know the battle continues." I smiled and texted back, "Good. Hope they win." The fight for property rights and freedom from HOA tyranny would continue. Other people would face similar battles. Some would win, some would lose. But thanks to what happened here, they'd have better laws, better precedents, and better chances. And they'd know that standing up to bullies, even official ones with lawyers and bylaws, was possible. I finished my beer and went inside, content. My home was mine. My land was mine. My choices were mine. The HOA that tried to take it all away was gone, dissolved, erased from existence by the same legal system it had tried to use as a weapon against me. Justice isn't always swift, but when it comes, it's sweet. The next morning, I got up early and went back to my normal life. I worked on the Camaro for a few hours, making good progress on the engine rebuild. I mowed the walking paths through my prairie grass, but left the rest natural. I picked tomatoes and peppers from the garden and made a big salad for lunch. In the afternoon, a family I didn't recognize drove slowly past my house. They stopped, and the driver rolled down his window. "Excuse me, is this the neighborhood where the HOA was dissolved?" "That's right," I said. "Excellent," he said with a huge grin. "We're moving here next month. I work from home and wanted a place where nobody would tell me I couldn't paint my office door red or fine me for having a basketball hoop in the driveway." "You'll like it here," I assured him. "Welcome to the neighborhood." They drove off, and I went back to my garden, smiling. The Willow Creek development, once controlled by a corrupt and power-hungry HOA board, had become something better. It had become a real community, diverse and free, where people chose to be good neighbors rather than being forced into conformity. And it all started because I refused to let them take what was mine. Sometimes the smallest act of resistance can change everything. Sometimes standing up for yourself can free dozens of other people. Sometimes one person really can make a difference. I was just a regular guy who wanted to work on his truck and grow his garden in peace. But when someone tried to take away my freedom, I fought back with everything I had. And I won. The HOA that tried to annex my property without consent no longer exists. It was dissolved by the state of Indiana for operating illegally, for fraud, for corruption, and for violating the rights of property owners. The people who ran it faced criminal charges. The laws were changed to prevent it from happening again. My property remains mine, free and clear, exactly as it should be. And every time I look at that framed letter from the Secretary of State confirming the dissolution of the Willow Creek HOA, I'm reminded that freedom is never free. Sometimes you have to fight for it. Sometimes you have to stand alone against people who think they have power over you. But if you stand firm, if you know your rights, and if you refuse to back down in the face of bullies and tyrants, you can win. I won. The HOA lost. Justice was served. And I lived happily ever after in my modest house on my 2 acres of land, with my restored truck, my prairie grass, my garden, and my freedom. No HOA required.